Hey, Mount Calvary Church and school students, it's Pastor Jonathan, and happy Friday. The weekend is almost here. And this just isn't a normal Friday. This is Good Friday, a day where we as believers pause and remember the amazing sacrifice that Jesus made on the cross for our sins. If you don't have a church family, I encourage you to join us tonight for our Good Friday service live streamed at 6 p.m. at mtcalvarychurch.com. We'd love to have you. So how is week 4 of your quarantine going? I think one of the most difficult things about the quarantine is that we've had to sacrifice some of our rights for the safety of others. We can't meet in groups like we normally can, like at church or youth group, or we can't go where we normally would want to go at any time because we are instructed to stay at home. And so we have had to give up some of these rights for the betterment of others, for the safety of others. And I think this is a great tie-in for our passage today in 1 Corinthians 9, 1 through 11. So take a moment and read those verses. So what is happening here in our passage? Well, the Apostle Paul, a man chosen by Jesus Christ to be his official messenger, has willingly sacrificed some of his rights or privileges. In chapter 8, we see that he willingly chose not to eat meat sacrificed to idols, even though idols weren't real. So he didn't cause anyone else to stumble. And now in chapter 9, we see that he has willingly chosen not to be compensated for his ministry while he was with the people in Corinth. And while these amazing sacrifices should be celebrated by the Corinthians, it actually led them to question his credentials. Was he really an apostle? And so Paul begins his defense in chapter 1 by asking 4 questions. He says, am I free? Am I not an apostle? Have I not seen Jesus? Are you not my workmanship in the Lord? And they know the answers to those questions are all yes. And Paul says that, even though others may question his apostleship, the Corinthians should not question it. He was with the Corinthians. He was there sharing the gospel of Jesus Christ with them, and they responded in faith. And so that is the seal or proof that he was God's representative, that he was God's messenger bringing the gospel to them. Paul knew he was under the microscope, and so being examined by others. And so he asked some more questions in verses 4 to 6. He says, did he and Barnabas have the right to food or drink as they ministered? And the answer is yes. He said, did he and Barnabas have the right to have believing wives with them like other apostles? And the answer is yes. And he says, were he and Barnabas the only apostles not worthy of paying for their work? The answer is no. Paul clearly states that the apostles have the right and should be compensated for their ministry. They also have the right to be married. But if the Corinthians refuse to believe him and his authority as an apostle, he directs them to look somewhere else. In verse 8, he points them to look to the authority of the law about compensating for those in ministry. Paul believed that the Old Testament law actually supported apostles receiving a livelihood from ministry. He quotes Deuteronomy 25:4 in 1 Corinthians 9:8 when he says, you shall not muzzle an ox when it's treading out the grain. And in Bible times, they would spread the grain out on a hard floor called the threshing floor, and they would take oxen and they would hook up a weighted board behind them, and the oxen would go in a circular motion threshing out the grain. And as they worked, they could eat as they worked. And so now Paul says that the Old Testament law in verse 10 was not only written for animals, but it was written for us when he says, does he not certainly speak for our sake? It was written for our sake because the plowman should plow in hope and the thresher thresh in hope of sharing in the crop. Paul says common sense dictates that people have a right to make a living from their work. So Paul closes out the passage with one more question in verse 11. He says, if we have sown spiritual things among you, is it too much if we reap material things from you? And again, the answer is yes. He had every right to be paid, but he didn't use that right. He gave up that right, instead sacrificing and enduring all kinds of troubles rather than do anything to hinder the proclamation of the gospel of Jesus Christ. And to those critical of Paul, they thought that he didn't exercise the right because he wasn't truly an apostle. But the fact of the matter is he laid those rights down, including the right to be paid for the work of the ministry to serve others. He willingly made sacrifices for the sake of the gospel. And Paul shows us that sometimes doing the right thing means that we'll sacrifice our rights for the sake of the gospel. And isn't that what Good Friday is all about? The cross wasn't Jesus' rightful place. He was innocent. Yet he laid down his rights and he sacrificed his life dying for our sins. And as believers, we celebrate this amazing act of love both on this Easter weekend and every day. So today, let's not be so focused on our rights, but be willing to sacrifice them and do what is right and love others.